Imagine a computer glitch so profound, it doesn't just freeze your screen. It actually reveals that the entire operating system you've been using is, well, it's stolen property.
Right, like a sudden error in the code that completely pulls back the curtain.
Exactly. It doesn't just stop the program from running, it shows you the fundamental hidden architecture of the machine itself. And today, we're doing a deep dive into a deeply provocative text that takes this exact mechanism but applies it to human existence.
It's a fascinating leap.
It really is. We are looking at a thesis that argues trans existence is not merely, a social identity, but a literal glitch in the capitalist patriarchal system, and that this glitch possesses a unique systemic intelligence.
It is an incredibly dense framework. I mean, it requires us to completely rethink how power structures operate and how human beings move through them.
Yeah, and before we really get into the mechanics of how all this works, I need to make a very clear disclaimer for everyone
It's very
listening.
important, yeah.
The source material we are guiding you through today contains, frankly, revolutionary and strongly politically charged concepts. They explicitly criticize capitalist and patriarchal structures. So I want to make it absolutely crystal clear to you listening, neither of us here is taking sides.
Right, we're not endorsing these political viewpoints.
Exactly. Our job today is strictly to act as impartial guides. We are here to neutrally unpack the philosophical framework and, the complex ideas contained in this original text so you can understand the author's argument.
We're basically examining the architecture of the idea. And to understand the author's architecture, we really have to start at the baseline of the source's argument.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So the text describes the capitalist patriarchal system as a single unified structure that fundamentally operates as a theft engine.
A theft engine. That's a strong term.
It is. The text argues its primary function is to extract power, generative intelligence, and resources from those it renders invisible. And then it redistributes all of that upward to the bodies it officially crowns as visible.
I mean, calling the entire global social order a theft engine is a massive, sweeping accusation. If we are talking about a machine designed to steal, what exactly are the mechanics of that extraction? Like, how does it get away with it on such a massive scale?
Well, the text asserts that a theft engine's primary structural vulnerability is that it requires absolute ignorance from the parties being stolen from.
Right. You can't steal from someone who's watching you do it.
Exactly. You cannot effectively and continuously steal from someone who knows exactly what they carry, what their value is, and, exactly how your trick is being pulled off.
So the system relies entirely on the invisibility of its own extraction process.
Yes, 100%. The people at the bottom cannot know how the people at the top are generating their power, and the people at the top must never acknowledge the source of their wealth. The chambers must remain entirely separate.
And this is exactly where the text introduces the concept of trans existence into the machinery. Okay?
Right.
Because the author argues that trans individuals inherently possess what is termed dual chamber witnessing.
That's the key phrase, dual chamber witnessing.
So they have inhabited one assigned position within this system. They've seen the machinery working from the inside of that specific chamber, and then they have crossed into another position and lived to see the machinery operating from that side as well.
They hold the embodied, lived knowledge of multiple chambers in a system that explicitly demands those chambers never communicate.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It makes me think of a magician's grand illusion.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right, because the trick entirely relies on the audience staying firmly in their assigned seats in the auditorium, looking straight ahead at the stage. If you sit there, the illusion is flawless. But if someone has spent years working as a stagehand backstage, learning all the rigging, and then they walk out and sit in the front row of the audience, the trick completely falls apart for them. They see both sides of the false walls.
Because they know exactly where the rabbit is hidden before the magician even reaches for the hat. And when you sit in the front row with that backstage knowledge, the false wall isn't just, a piece of scenery anymore. It becomes a highly visible mechanism of deception.
Wow, yeah.
The system was engineered specifically for an audience that only sees one side of the wall. And the text argues that this is precisely why the patriarchal structure registers trans people as a structural glitch.
Because they see too much.
Right. When a human being can perceive the full scope of the extraction machinery, they become an existential threat to the illusion of natural order. Therefore, the system deploys its most sophisticated defense mechanisms against them.
Which the text identifies as historical erasure and medical pathologization.
Exactly. And because they possess this dual-chamber perspective, the text claims that their very movement through the world acts as an infiltration.
So it doesn't just call it a social transition, it calls it a literal hack of the binary system.
It functions as a hack because it involves the unauthorized crossing of socialization codes. The engine only functions by keeping these behavioral and survival codes strictly separated.
And the specific data points the text uses to illustrate this hacking process are really granular.
Yeah.
For instance, it argues that trans women carry the deeply ingrained live data of male socialization. The text points out that they know the permission structures, those unspoken assumptions that a room belongs to you, that your voice inherently holds weight. They know the invisible doors of institutional power, and they know the exact scripts that men are handed to maintain authority. And profoundly, the text emphasizes that they willingly choose to leave that position of power.
Which the author argues fundamentally undermines the patriarchy's greatest psychological asset.
Which is?
The bedrock assumption that men do not voluntarily surrender the position of dominance.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's heavy. And then conversely, the text examines the experience of trans men, arguing they bring female socialization directly into the realm of male social legibility.
Right, they carry traits the author defines as constant threat assessment.
That exhausting, continuous scanning of an environment for physical and social safety.
Exactly, along with what the text calls relational labor. They bring these survival codes into a male domain where the system believed it had completely eradicated or separated those specific traits.
Okay, let me push back here, though. Because if trans people completely leave their assigned chambers, doesn't the system just, lock the door behind them and ignore them?
You would think so, but no.
Like, why is this framed as such a massive structural vulnerability? How does simply leaving one room and entering another, or comparing notes, threaten a global patriarchal structure?
What's fascinating here is that the structural threat, according to the text, isn't just the exit, it is the arrival. The system's processing logic relies on pure, untainted chambers.
Okay.
A glitch occurs when a program receives an input it was fundamentally not designed to process. The systemic program can process a standard man or a standard woman behaving according to their isolated scripts.
Right, following the rules.
Exactly. What it absolutely cannot process is an individual operating inside the male sphere who carries the comprehensive archive of female threat assessment, or someone in the female sphere who fully understands the architecture of male permission structures.
Because they're running incompatible scripts inside the system's most secure servers.
Yes. They bridge two realities that were explicitly ordered never to touch.
So does this mean the system's absolute worst nightmare is people comparing notes? Are trans people essentially walking, breathing whistleblowers, bridging chambers that were strictly ordered not to communicate?
That is exactly the argument the source is making, yes.
And if the system can rewrite the rules of social engagement to maintain these boundaries, it implies that it fundamentally controls our perception of reality itself. Which brings us to the text's next major claim.
The historical angle.
Right. This bridging doesn't just expose modern social codes. The source argues it exposes the deeply hidden historical method of how the system builds its power across centuries.
The text shifts from a sociological analysis of the present to a historical analysis of the past. It frames the dominant historical narrative of human progress as a massive, ongoing process of credit laundering.
Credit laundering. So the source claims that the patriarchal system routinely takes its generative intelligence, like the actual brilliant ideas, discoveries, and labor, from uncredited bodies it has made invisible. And then it launders that intelligence through crowned, visible bodies. It operates exactly like money laundering, but for human genius.
That's a great way to put it. And the primary historical example the source highlights to anchor this concept is Mileva Maric.
Albert Einstein's first wife.
Yes. She was a brilliant physicist and mathematician in her own right. And by many historical accounts cited in the text, she was his intellectual equal and perhaps the intellectual origin point for much of his early work.
Yeah, the text goes into specific detail here, mentioning she was heavily present in the foundational correspondence and the rigorous mathematical checking for the theory of special relativity. I mean, that is a foundational pillar of modern science.
It is. Yet she was systematically erased from the official historical record upon the dissolution of their marriage and, as Einstein's fame grew.
Wow.
And the text argues this wasn't just an accident of history or some personal failing. It is how the theft engine is designed to operate. The scientific community of that era systematically stripped female contributors of credit to maintain the illusion of solitary male genius.
And marriage identity is crucial here, isn't it?
It is. The author notes she lived at the edge of multiple boundary crossings. She was a woman in the male-dominated field of physics, a Serbian operating in a German-speaking academic world, someone whose very bearing defied easy categorization.
As the system finds the code being generated in an invisible chamber, extracts it, hands it to a visible body, builds a monument to the theft, and then writes a history book pretending the visible body invented it out of thin air.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the genius, according to this framework, was never entirely the patriarchy's. The deepest secret of the system is that its most celebrated creations are built on suppressed intelligence.
Right.
And this reveals why the trans perspective is framed as so incredibly disruptive. If the system relies on uncredited labor and trans individuals possess the dual-chamber witnessing required to see this extraction from both sides, then their visibility isn't merely a debate about social roles.
It creates an epistemological crisis.
Yeah.
It forces us to question the origin of every piece of knowledge we hold, asking not just what we know, but who actually built it and whose name was erased to sell it to us.
Exactly.
Okay, we need to slow down here because the text takes a massive radical leap at this point. We've gone from sociology to historical credit laundering. But then the author elevates this concept of social hacking into a literal metaphysical mechanic of time and memory.
Yes, it introduces a concept it calls sexual time travel.
When I first read the heading sexual time travel, I assumed it was purely a metaphor.
It's undoubtedly the most complex and provocative abstraction in the source material. The author defines it as the movement of awareness and witness across the apparent linearity of time achieved through embodied categorical crossing.
But the text insists on treating this as a precise mechanic of information architecture. Like moving through social codes equates to moving through time.
It's why.
To explain this, the author provides a very specific, almost Victorian-era staging as an anecdote. Can we break down the mechanics of this story?
Sure. The text paints a highly stylized picture of two black men in formal dress. They are navigating survival in a deeply hostile society through strict performative adherence to the respectability codes of that era.
Okay.
The first man is speaking to the second man, explaining the intricate social maneuverings of how a particular woman was won. He's narrating the subtle conquest, describing his actions with a first woman while performing these rigid codes of respectability with a second.
But the crucial twist in the text is what the second man is doing. While the first man is narrating his linear conquest, the second man, invisibly and entirely beyond the first man's perception, has already traveled back into that moment with the first woman.
Yes.
The text states he has already interfaced with her, already moved through that exact temporal field that the first man firmly believes is his exclusive present tense domain. The text uses a defining phrase here. The first man narrates, the second man operates.
It's a really intricate metaphor for awareness.
I have to admit, I struggled with the temporal logic of this when I was reviewing the material. Let me offer an analogy to see if we can ground this for the listener.
Go for it.
Is it kind of similar to the experience of watching a movie prequel after you have already seen the sequel?
Oh, that's interesting.
Right, because the characters in the prequel are operating under the illusion that time is linear. They're acting out, I do this, and then this consequence happens. But you, as the viewer, are already way ahead of them.
You know how it ends.
Exactly. You are inhabiting their past, but you hold the full knowledge of their future. Therefore, their linear timeline is being simultaneously inhabited by a witness who fundamentally exists outside their sequence.
That's a fantastic way to look at it. The text takes that prequel-sequel dynamic a step further, though, by arguing that this isn't just about passive observation. It alters the validity of the space.
How so?
The source argues that trans individuals perform this exact temporal operation as an existential constant. When they look back on the chamber of their former bodily and social assignment, they're doing so with full witness. They hold intricate, lived information from a future state that their former socialization had not yet reached.
So they carry the memory of a position the system is currently occupying, while actively standing in a position the system thought was completely sealed off in a different timeline.
Precisely. They are witnessing the system's past from the system's future. In the framework of information architecture, the author insists this reroutes the linear sequence of how power is transmitted.
Wait. So we're moving directly from the sociology of gender into literal metaphysics.
Mm.
The text is actually claiming that this ability to inhabit the prequel while holding the sequel's knowledge isn't just a byproduct of living in society, but an intentional spiritual design.
The text absolutely makes that leap. It asks why this temporal hack happens at all, and it answers by viewing the phenomenon through the lens of what it calls soul cosmology.
Soul cosmology.
Right, and it introduces the concept of diagnostic infiltration.
Okay, diagnostic infiltration. Let's unpack that.
So in this spiritual framework, the soul does not accidentally arrive in a body that experiences gender dysphoria or requires categorical crossing.
Yeah.
The crossing is the explicit assignment. Souls purposefully choose incarnations that require them to cross massive systemic boundaries. They arrive in a form specifically to access a highly guarded, unintegrated chamber of human experience.
Wow.
They are tasked with living it fully as participants, basically archiving the raw data of that experience, and then they cross.
And once they cross, they are uniquely positioned to diagnose the system. The text points out that they arrive exactly where the system's denial about itself is the loudest.
Exactly. And the source uses the mechanics of high-level espionage to illustrate this.
Oh, right, the espionage part.
True espionage isn't about sneaking into a building in the dark to steal a file. It is about absolute fluency. The greatest operative doesn't just mimic the behaviors of the target environment. They are native to two worlds simultaneously.
So they don't trigger the system's internal alarms because they actually live there. They were formed by the very codes they are now observing from the outside.
Spot on.
So what does this all mean for us today? If we bring this sweeping soul cosmology down to the immediate reality we're living in right now, how does the text apply this framework to the real world? Like, why are the legislative and political attacks so intense right now?
The text answers this by examining the system's automated defense mechanisms. The patriarchal capitalist structure is calibrated entirely to recognize and defend against binary opposition.
Right, man versus woman.
Exactly. It knows how to fight a man trying to dominate a woman's domain, or a woman trying to claim a man's domain. What its sensors are absolutely not calibrated for is a human being who is genuinely formed in one domain, has genuinely crossed into the other, and carries the living architecture of both.
So the system software is crashing because it can't categorize the threat.
And because it cannot process the input, it responds with overwhelming force. The text argues that the severe legislative attacks and the intense cultural focus are not peripheral manufactured culture war noise.
They're not just a distraction.
No, they are the system identifying with remarkable, terrified accuracy where its most structurally significant vulnerability lies. The system knows exactly what trans people carry, even when those individuals have been heavily conditioned by society to doubt their own perceptions.
So in this framework, the persecution is actually a hidden confession of systemic fragility. The most powerful codes capable of rewriting the architecture of domination are held by the exact people the structure is most urgently trying to eliminate.
It is the core of the thesis, yes.
Man, so we've mapped the entire architecture of the author's argument. We've uncovered the glitch, we've explored the hack of crossing social codes, the historical credit laundering, and this wild metaphysical concept of diagnostic infiltration. But what is the ultimate endgame for you, the listener, to take away from this profound breakdown of systemic power?
Well, the text is adamant that exposing the theft engine is just the beginning of the process. The actual end game is integration.
Integration.
Right. The goal proposed by the author is not to violently tear down the binary walls by force. That would simply utilize the system's own tools of domination. The argument is that when these isolated chambers, the male experience of power, the female experience of suppression, and the non-binary threshold as a permanent habitation, when they are brought into a fully witnessed, metabolized relationship with each other, the binary architecture begins to dissolve on its own.
It doesn't break. It dissolves through coherence.
Exactly. The system simply cannot sustain itself when its most heavily guarded separations become visible and integrated. The engine was built on the absolute assumption that those false walls would hold forever. The glitch, as the text frames it, isn't an error in the human program. The glitch is the program's evolution, arriving before the obsolete system was ready to process it.
To bring all of this vast philosophy into your everyday reality, consider how the concept of the theft engine and credit laundering operates in spaces you navigate daily. Think about, well, a standard corporate boardroom.
Oh, that's a perfect everyday example.
Right. You have the invisible workers who actually generate the intelligence, do the relational labor, and assess the threats. And then you have the visible figures at the head of the table who present that work, claiming the credit and the power.
Mm-hmm.
The structure relies entirely on the invisible workers never speaking up, and the visible figures never acknowledging the extraction. We started this deep dive by talking about how a glitch shatters the comforting illusion of a perfectly ordered system. The revolutionary text we explore today suggests that ultimate truth exists precisely in the spaces where the system loudly insists everything is already settled.
It really makes you look at everything differently.
It does. So I want to leave you with a concrete question to mull over long after this audio stops. Look closely at your own life, your workplace, and the historical narratives you've been taught to accept without question. What other settled truths in your world might actually just be invisible walls, silently relying on your ignorance and waiting for a glitch to expose them?